My name is Cathy King Broad, and I am Tim King's older sister. Since March 16th, 1977, I have missed my brother Tim every single day. But long ago, I gave up any hope of the case ever being solved, and I let go of as much of that part of his life, that last week of his life, as I could, because I felt like I would go crazy if that's what I focused on. In the summer of 2005, my family moved from Idaho back to the Midwest, and it was something I had always really feared because it triggers a lot of memories and bad memories at that for me. I did not realize until my brother Chris told me that in February of 2005, the Michigan State Police had rejuvenated the Oakland County Child Killer Task Force. We did not really realize why it had been rejuvenated, but just knew that they had leads, that they were actively investigating, and they were asking for the public's help. And during that time, my brother contacted me because I was now living in the Midwest to give me a heads up so that I wouldn't be caught off guard in case the Chicago area papers picked this up. So I did some research online, and I found out that they were investigating a suspect by the name of Ted Lamborghini, who was a pedophile who had moved to Cleveland. And the spokespeople for the state police were adamant that they would leave no stone unturned and that they wanted the public's help. But when I looked further online and saw that there were actually websites devoted to these 36 and 37-year-old crimes, the common theme of the people participating in those websites was that they had gone to the police early and often, and they had been blown off big time every single time they went back to try to give their information. So it was really disheartening to me because on the one hand, they're asking the public for information, and on the other, in this kind of subculture of this website world, people are describing these experiences that they had when they went to the state police, and they were dismissed out of hand. So it made no sense. I then started looking further into the stuff online. I had been to my parents' house, and I found a box of newspaper articles that my mother had saved from during the time my brother was missing and probably going into the early 80s. I read everything I could get my hands on, and it was obvious to me that huge mistakes had been made and that something was very wrong with this investigation, especially when you contrasted it with what was now taking place post-rejuvenation of the task force. I contacted a friend who was a police officer in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, then later a police chief in Idaho. He had been appointed by the governor of Idaho to be on the Idaho Department of Corrections. He was a private polygrapher at this point and also a private investigator. I contacted him and told him my story and told him my concerns about the investigation. And he agreed to review everything that I would send him and that he would give me his impressions because I trusted his judgment. Toward the end of the conference, he said, "Cathy, I just want you to know the Michigan State Police have a very fine reputation, and I'm friends with some of those polygraphers because I go to a National Polygraph Conference every year, and there's one in July, so 2 months from the time I'm speaking with him, and I will talk to some of these guys on the side and see what this task force is really up to and if there's some meat to these allegations about other suspects, and then I'll get back to you." And I said, "Well, that's interesting. I have a childhood friend by the name of Patrick Coffey, who's a polygrapher from California. Have you ever met him? Do you know him? Because if he is at this conference, he grew up, he knows the story, he has a different vantage point, but you could compare notes with him as well." And my friend Steve, stopped speaking and said, "Yeah, I know Pat Coffey." He said, "I just taught a course with him in Idaho 2 weeks ago." Steve was living in Idaho at the time. Patrick was a polygrapher in California. The person that was supposed to teach with my friend Steve could not make it, and Patrick got sent in at the last minute. So it was the first of many, I guess you could call them coincidences, that would occur over the next 6 or 7 years. So he said, yes, if Patrick's there, I'll speak to him about the case, and I'll find out what I can for you, Cathy, and I'll get back to you. I let it go as much as I could and actually forgot that this conference was coming up in Las Vegas toward the end of July 2006. I get a call from Steve that week at home, and he said, Cathy, I have someone who's going to call you to talk to you about your brother's case, and I don't want you to be alarmed. And he said, it's Patrick. And I said, so you did meet up with Patrick? And he said, yes, I did, and he will be calling you later. Steve kind of wanted to lay the groundwork so I wouldn't be completely blindsided. What happened was this. Patrick was at the conference. He was giving a talk, a seminar to a bunch of the polygraphers about one of his areas of expertise. At the conclusion of his talk, a man came up to him, gave him his business card, and said, I am a polygrapher in Southfield, Michigan. This issue comes up a lot in Michigan, and would you ever come speak to my Michigan polygraph group? And Patrick Coffey, a childhood friend who had grown up across the street from us, said, I would love to come speak to your group, and it's interesting that you mention this because I spent some of my teen years in Birmingham. And he looked at the man's business card, and it was Larry Wasser from Southfield, Michigan. Patrick said, it's interesting, I picked this profession because of what happened to my neighbor. I don't know if you remember the Oakland County child killer case. My neighbor was Timmy King, and I went into polygraphy in part because I was so moved by the hideousness of that crime and what happened. Patrick said that at that moment, Larry Wasser's entire demeanor changed. And I'd actually like to read to you from an email Patrick sent me on Thursday, July 27th, 2006, describing this interaction because it's contemporaneous to when it happened. July 15th, my presentation with the board of directors of the American Polygraph Association went very well, and these icon members of the polygraph community were very intrigued about my concept of using computer polygraph as a shield rather than a sword. What was intended to go 20 minutes turned into 45 with their questions. I mention this because one senior examiner in our field approached me asking if I might do this same presentation before the Michigan Association of Polygraph Examiners for their next conference, and I agreed. I mentioned that I had previously lived in Michigan in my youth and further mentioned Birmingham. He gave me his card, which showed that his office was nearby. I don't know exactly why, but I was moved to mention the Timmy King case that still remained in my heart all of these years. In doing so, I saw his heart miss a beat, and he went flush with an unexpected change in facial expression. He went on to speak with me as a fellow professional in our most rare and confided field that he had performed an attorney-client privilege polygraph test for the man who was in fact the murderer of young Timmy King in the case which came to be known as Oakland County child killings. He further informed me that both the perpetrator was now dead as well as the attorney who represented him. Try to imagine the weight placed on my heart from that conversation if you can. I knew I would soon be calling Chris King and Cathy King, who I had spoken to some 4 or 5 years prior. When Patrick called me in July of 2006, he prefaced the phone call by saying, Cathy, you're an attorney, so I know you'll understand that this is an attorney-client privileged polygraph and what the ramifications of that are. The perpetrator's attorney had contacted Larry Wasser and asked him to conduct the polygraph, meaning that he was now subject to the rules of confidentiality that the attorney would be. So this was something that Larry Wasser never should have revealed to anybody. And frankly, he breached the attorney-client privilege by telling Patrick Coffey. But he was obviously very concerned. Immediately after he told Patrick, he kind of shut down and realized what he had done. And Patrick just rolled with it, tried to get a little more information, but that was the end of the conversation. It ended with, about the part about the suspect, it ended with, I'm telling you this because the perpetrator is dead and the attorney who represented him is also dead. So he's obviously a little less worried about the breach because he knows the people who might come after him are gone. So Patrick told me that he had also spoken with my brother Chris. He reiterated that he had been invited to come to Michigan to speak to Larry Wasser's polygraph group. He said he intended to take him up on that invitation, and at that time he would try to speak to Mr. Wasser one-on-one and try to get some clue about who this person was so that the police could at least do a little bit of investigating on it. They wouldn't have to get the name from Larry Wasser. If Wasser could just give enough information to Patrick, if he was willing, the ball could get rolling. Well, Patrick wrote back to Mr. Wasser and sent his resume and never heard back from him again. It was obvious that Mr. Wasser deeply regretted his slip of the tongue. And but backing up again to the phone call, Patrick asked my brother and I to tell no one about this, but to give him a little bit of time so he could basically work on getting Mr. Wasser to, follow his conscience and give some sort of guidance about who this person was so that somebody could do the right thing. So I also realized that Mr. Wasser could ruin Pat's career. Mr. Wasser was pretty high up in the National Polygraph Organization, and this was not we were really in a quandary with what to do with this information. Patrick told my brother Chris, who still lives in Birmingham, the Birmingham area, to go speak to police and find out if there's some way we could get a list of suspects who were deceased, who had been represented by counsel, who was also now deceased. It just doesn't seem that hard. Those are three things that could have narrowed the search. Chris was told by the Birmingham police that this was a virtual impossibility. The list of suspects was the size of a small phone book. None of this information was at all categorized in any way that would allow them to give Chris this information. And by the way, Chris did not go into any detail about why we wanted that information. It was very vague, but nevertheless, we didn't get anywhere. The weeks turned into months, and I was beside myself because I really did not know what to do with the information. As we came up to July of 2007, it had been almost a year, and I knew I had to do something with this information. That month, my dad came to Naperville, where I live, and told me that the Michigan State Police had broken off their relationship with Detective Corey Williams from the Livonia Police Department. There had been some parting, and they were no longer communicating. I also knew from speaking with my brother Chris that when he had met with the state police and Corey Williams, that Chris's impression was that Corey Williams was the only one who had any hustle, was the only one who knew what was going on in the case, was asking all the right questions, and the two representatives of the state police were basically just there for the ride. When my dad told me that that relationship had broken off, I felt like I had my answer. I knew I could talk to Corey Williams because I could ask him not to tell what I was going to tell him to the state police. Because remember, going back to 2006, when I start looking at some of the stuff online, I know the state police are not going to take this seriously. They're going to say, thank you very much, and probably get Patrick fired, and nothing good would come of it. So the following week, on July 31st, 2007, I called Detective Corey Williams at the Livonia Police Department, told him who I was, and before I went any further, I said, I'm not going to talk to you unless you promise me that you won't tell the state police anything of what I'm going to tell you. And he agreed, because he said he no longer had a relationship with them. And then I went on to tell him what happened with Patrick and Larry Wasser at that conference a year prior. And the reason I told him I don't want you to talk to the state police about this is because I said this will go nowhere. I've seen what happens to people who come with legitimate information, and it goes into the circular file, and they pat you on the back and say thank you very much and send you on your way. He immediately picked up on the importance of this lead. It certainly was something he felt that needed to be investigated, and he contacted Assistant Prosecuting Attorney for Wayne County, Rob Moran, and got back to me within 2 hours, and we had a game plan. Before I describe what took place there, I just want to point out that it would be many more months, but we would later learn that July 31st, the day I called Corey Williams, was Chris Bush's birthday. And it was yet another of so many coincidences or weird signs that it makes your head ache. But when Corey called back, he said that Rob Moran was doing some research on the possibility of getting an investigative subpoena, which would force Larry Wasser to come and speak about what he told Patrick. And in a way, it would have provided him a lot of protection if he had just been honest, because under the investigative subpoena statutes, everything is secret. No one would have known where this information came from, how the ball got running, or how things got started, any of that. But when he, about a week later, ended up down at the Livonia Police Department to talk to Corey Williams in response to this investigative subpoena, he was completely freaked out. He brought his attorney, James Feinberg. He was going sideways. He was telling Corey things that he would later deny saying. He told Detective Williams that, yeah, he remembered a suspect, but he couldn't remember his name. It was so long ago and so vague, and he didn't keep any of his files anyway, so this was all rather pointless. Luckily, Wayne County did not take a back seat and just give up. They kept after Mr. Wasser, and they ended up in court. They ended up in the lower court arguing over the investigative subpoena. And anyone who's been in litigation knows that the whole story is delay, delay, delay. And that's what they attempted. But this actually moved relatively quickly. The judge, Rob Moran, did a magnificent job researching the case law, and he made the argument that all they wanted was the name of this man. They don't want to look at this man's files. They don't want to look at the polygraph charts. They just want the name. And they wouldn't give it up. And the judge said, you're going to give up the name. So Wasser and Feinberg took what was essentially an interlocutory appeal to the Michigan Court of Appeals. It sits around up in that system for a while. The court comes back and tells the lower court, you're right, this guy has to give you the name. Then it goes up to they appeal to the Michigan Supreme Court. More briefing, more arguing, more time passes. But it's still happening rather rapidly. The Supreme Court denies, it all gets affirmed, and basically we're now in November. So this process started in late July, we're now in November, and the court's saying, okay, you're going to give me the name. They set up the hearing. Before the hearing, Wasser and Feinberg, Rob Moran, and Corey Williams all have a powwow, which is often common before hearings. And by the way, Patrick Coffey has flown in from California on his own dime to give testimony under oath in case Mr. Wasser decides to go sideways at the hearing. But Mr. Wasser doesn't want to raise his right hand. He doesn't want to testify. He doesn't want to get on the stand. So they cut this deal where his attorney, James Feinberg, basically says, my client doesn't remember any of this, but he does remember that the person was polygraphed and cleared by Ralph Cabot at the Michigan State Police. So Wayne County says, wait a minute, you can't remember the client's name, but you remember that this client passed a polygraph in the child killing case conducted by Ralph Cabot. Yes. So how about if we get all the files, and there can't be that many, of suspects who were polygraphed in Flint by Ralph Cabot, put them on a conference table. My client will come in. He won't testify today because he doesn't remember the name. He'll look at the files and he'll help you out, and maybe he'll be able to even give you more information. So Wayne County agrees, and then they went ahead and they took Patrick's testimony under oath to get him on the record, because Patrick was then going to fly back to California. It is a felony in Michigan to give perjured testimony in a murder investigation. Larry Wasser never went under oath. A few days later, they meet, and the files are in fact on the table, and he engages in what I describe as a charade. He looks at a couple of the files, picks up one, and says, oh, this rings a bell. Yes, his father was a chief financial officer for GM. He had just returned from Europe before the Mark Stebbins murder. I think this is the guy. But he never utters the name on the file jacket, which is Christopher Bush. So he plays what I believe is just the dirtiest game, because he can then leave that room and say, I never gave up Chris Bush's name. And remember, this was started out with an investigative subpoena. He could have just written Chris Bush's name on a piece of paper and passed it across the table to Corey Williams. And I would have never known about any of this, and none of you would either. But he had to play the game the whole way through. But he says, yeah, this is the guy. And then Corey looks at the file and says, oh, yeah, this is stuff you told me on the phone last night when you called me, because Wasser started having some recollections. So he and Detective Williams have spoken twice at length prior to the charade where he gives up Chris Bush's name. So soon after that, another point I need to make is that the investigative subpoena was based on information that came from me. Corey Williams did not call me up and tell me what was going on with the investigative subpoena. I called him, and he needed the information from me. So there was no breach of secrecy rules. I am the source of the information that was the basis for the investigative subpoena. So after that meeting, Detective Williams called me and said, does the name Bush ring a bell? And did any of you guys go to high school with someone with the last name of Bush? And I said, yes, B-U-S-H. And he said, no, B-U-S-C-H. I said, no, that name doesn't ring a bell. He said there were 4 brothers, and they lived very close to Seaholm High School, which is where we went to school. It didn't ring a bell. And I just want to back up at this point, too, and also tell you that right before Patrick flew there in November to give testimony, that is when I told my family members what was going on, because I had told Detective Williams I would tell no one about what was going on, and I did not. So in November, once there's going to be hearing, everybody's on the same page. So after Detective Williams had mentioned the name Bush, I called my friend Lisa Milton, who's an attorney here in the area, and I ran this information by her. And she did a search and came up with the name H. Lee Bush, who had 4 sons, the youngest of whom had killed himself in November of 1978. And I remember distinctly saying to her, we have a winner. That's who it is. It's Chris Bush. That is the person that's on the name of that file jacket. And so Corey Williams did not come to me and say, did you know Christopher Bush? He said, did your family have any contact with a Bush family? Then I called him and said, is it Chris Bush? And he said, yes, that's the name. Very soon after that, my friend Lisa obtained the death certificate of Chris Bush. We got it before the police had it, before the state police, before Livonia PD. She also attempted to get the police file on his suicide from the Bloomfield Township Police Department. And it probably took a month, but they responded that it had been destroyed in the ordinary course of business. And Lisa told me that's the result I expected. It was a long time ago. Anyway, the file doesn't exist. We would learn 2 years later, yeah, the file did exist, and it was given to my father by a reporter who obtained it under the Freedom of Information Act. During the time period where this is all going on, I was in contact with my friend Lisa Milton, who I told you is an attorney, and we had discussed numerous times who this attorney might be who represented Christopher Bush. And we knew it was a woman because Corey Williams had talked to me and used the word she a couple of times. And there were not that many female attorneys in practicing criminal law in the Detroit area in the 1970s. Between Lisa and I putting our heads together and me bouncing some stuff off Corey Williams, we determined that the attorney was Jane Burgess, who in fact had died of cancer in the 1990s. I did a search. Her husband, Larry Burgess, practices to this day with their son, David Burgess, in downtown Detroit. As I looked at the information on the screen, I also saw that, lo and behold, James Feinberg, Larry Wasser's attorney, shares office space with Burgess and Burgess. So it's been a neat little family gig for decades. So there had to have been great wringing of hands when this all came to light for both Mr. Feinberg and Mr. Wasser, and then it made perfect sense why they would fight this so hard rather than just do the right thing. So this whole thing is so sickening to me because we had to live through it the first time. I had to live through it a second time in 2006 and 2007 when this was all happening in real time, and there was just this horrible clarity about, A, the errors that had been made in the investigation, and B, the finagling and dirty dealings that must have taken place to keep information like this from ever seeing the light of day. And I can't even really explain to you the horrible clarity that just settled over me, because for all of those years, I had always believed the police broke their backs on this case and they had done everything they could. And it was painfully obvious that nothing, while there were a lot of good cops on the street who had tried their hardest, something was very, very wrong with this investigation. What happened subsequent to this is Detective Williams and Detective Gray from the state police, they really did do a fabulous job investigating this Chris Bush lead. But it was never exhausted. And when I spoke to Corey Williams on the phone in July of 2007, I said to him, I just want this lead taken seriously, and I want it followed to its logical conclusion. It's July 2013, and it has not been followed to its logical conclusion. I would also point out that Patrick Coffey's story has never changed. Mr. Wasser's changed from the second he knew Pat Coffey had spoken to somebody and that the word was out. His story has changed repeatedly. The behavior of Larry Wasser, in my opinion, is reprehensible. He could have done the right thing and he didn't. I also would like to reiterate that because of the demeanor and the defensiveness of the Michigan State Police in the months leading up to when I contacted Detective Williams, that is a reason why I would have never told them any of this information. I would have never picked up the phone and called Gary Gray because of the demeanor of the way they conducted themselves in front of my dad and my brother, which is equally appalling, in my opinion. I want to close by reading to you from a letter I sent to Detective Williams September 10th, 2007. This is after he had started the ball rolling. We still didn't know it was Christopher Bush. I said, "Looking forward, Corey, I don't need to know a name, certainly not before the parents of the kids are informed of whatever develops. My concerns at this point are that Patrick will somehow be harmed in all of this, and that my dad might press to go forward with this civil suit, the Lamborghini suit, before any decisions can be made in light of what you find out. I will say this, however. These cases have been in serious need of some sunshine to disinfect the taint around how they have been handled. If it turns out that this guy is a killer, that he was questioned, polygraphed, and cleared by the Michigan State Police, they had better go for the straightforward mistakes were made approach and not try to hide anything or destroy any records. I am sure if the MSP think about it long enough, they will conclude that people are much more understanding and accepting when they hear this sort of information directly from the police rather than from a media outlet. Personally, if this works out, down the road, I would want to know who the guy was, who turned him in, when and why, how many times his name was turned in, whether his name was turned in to a local police department as well as the task force, when he was questioned, when he was cleared, the last contact they had with him, what other crimes he committed or is alleged to have committed before and after he was cleared, the cars he had access to, where he lived, where he could have kept the kids hostage, where he worked, when and how he died, and whether police believe he acted alone, and if not, who else was involved. This is not because I'm transferring some lingering rage about what happened onto the MSP. I think we deserve to know the truth, all of it. I don't think that is too much to ask. I would also like for Patrick to review this guy's MSP polygraph chart and hear his impressions of the exam results." And then I thanked him by saying, "Thank you again for having an open mind, for also being tenacious and for putting this together and taking a chance. I realize how much work you have put in so far and have some idea of how much more remains. I totally appreciate it, and I will always be grateful." I had no idea 7 more years would remain. And I think that what I told Detective Williams I wanted to know, 3 months before we knew it was Chris Bush, those are all fair questions. And why nobody can look my dad in the face and answer those questions is, I'll use the word again, it's just appalling to me.